Nina grabbed my wrist so hard her fingers left bruises I didn't notice for 2 days. She didn't say anything. She just pointed at the tree line, and I saw it standing there in the fog wearing Tyler's jacket. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how these things go when you try to write them down. You jump to the part that broke something inside you because your brain wants to start there, wants to skip the normal parts, the boring parts, the parts where everything was fine and you didn't know yet that fine was about to become a word that didn't apply to your life anymore. So let me back up. Let me start where it actually started, which is with a trip that was supposed to be simple. I spent 6 years in the Army, most of it in signals and communications. When you do that kind of work, you learn two things about yourself. You learn that you're good at paying attention to details that other people walk right past, and you learn that the most dangerous thing isn't the loud problem, it's the quiet one. The thing that doesn't announce itself, the absence of signal where a signal should be. That training didn't go away when I got out. It just changed what it was pointed at. And in late September of 2023, it was pointed at a creek in the Ozarks that stopped making sound for 90 seconds, and I didn't even notice. The trip was my idea. I'd been planning it for months, which is how I do things. I don't wing it. I don't just grab a pack and go. I build the plan the way I used to build communication protocols, layer by layer, with redundancy built in at every stage. The route was a 4-day loop through the backcountry trail system along one of the tributaries feeding into the Buffalo River in the Ozark National Forest up in northern Arkansas. I'd hiked sections of it twice before, solo, and I knew the terrain well enough to feel comfortable bringing other people into it. The trail wasn't maintained in places. There were sections where you were navigating by map and instinct more than by blazes on trees. But I knew where the water was, where the elevation dropped, where the fog collected in the valleys at night. I knew the land well enough to trust it. I filed a float plan with the ranger station at Ponca before we left. That's not something most recreational hikers bother with, but it's what you do when you're taking people into country where cell service doesn't exist and the nearest road is a 40-minute drive on gravel. I gave them our route, our expected camp locations, and a check-in schedule. If we missed 2 consecutive check-ins on the satellite messenger, they'd know something was wrong. It was a precaution, not a prediction. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. I never do. That's probably the thing I should have learned better. There were 4 of us. Tyler was my college buddy, the kind of guy who fills every silence with something, a joke, an opinion, a story about something that happened to him freshman year that he's told at least 6 times, but tells better each time. He's not reckless, he's just loud. He'd been asking me to take him out here for 2 years, and I finally ran out of excuses. Luke was Tyler's older brother, quieter, more competent in the woods than Tyler by a wide margin. He's the kind of person who can read a creek bed and tell you where the fish are just by looking at how the water moves over the rocks. He carried a fishing rod on every trip he'd ever taken, regardless of whether fishing was part of the plan. It was part of his plan regardless, and Nina was my girlfriend. She's a nurse, which means she notices things about people that most people don't. The way someone holds their weight when something hurts, the color of someone's skin when they're not getting enough oxygen, small biological details that most of us filter out. She's also the most quietly competent person I know, which is something I didn't fully appreciate until that trip. We drove up from Little Rock on Wednesday, September 20th, 2023, left before dawn. The drive up through the Ozarks is one of those stretches of highway where the country starts to change around you in a way you can feel before you see it. The hills get steeper, the trees get denser, the towns get smaller and further apart until they stop entirely, and it's just 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through hills that have been there longer than anything else in the state. We turned off the highway onto a county road, then off that onto a Forest Service road, then off that onto a dirt track that barely qualified as a road at all by the time we parked at the trailhead. The air outside was cool and damp and smelled like wet leaves and creek water, and that particular earthy smell you get in the Ozarks when the ground is still holding moisture from a recent rain. It hadn't rained in 3 days, but the forest holds water like a sponge. It stays damp down there, even when the sky is clear. Gear check took 20 minutes. I do it every time, even when I've packed the bags myself. Headlamps with fresh batteries, 2 sets each. Water filters, bear spray, which in Arkansas is less about bears and more about the general principle that you should carry something that makes you feel less small. First aid kit with enough in it to handle anything short of a broken bone. Satellite messenger clipped to my pack strap. Paper maps in a waterproof sleeve. Compass, 2 phones with offline trail maps downloaded. Food for 5 days, because I always pack a day more than the trip requires. Tyler had his fishing rod, which he'd somehow rigged to collapse down to the length of his forearm. Luke had one too, a lighter setup, more practical. We shouldered up and started walking just after 9 in the morning. The first day was exactly what I had planned for. The trail dropped down from the ridge into a valley where a tributary creek ran cold and clear over a bed of chert and sandstone. The water was loud enough that you could hear it from a quarter-mile out, a constant low rushing sound that filled the valley like white noise. The canopy overhead was thick enough to block most of the direct sunlight, but thin enough that shafts of it came through in places, hitting the creek surface and turning it gold. Tyler talked. Luke fished at every promising pool we passed. Nina walked beside me and pointed out things I'd have missed. A spider web catching the light in a way that made it look like a strand of glass. A turtle half buried in the mud at the edge of the creek. The way the moss on the north side of the rocks was a different shade of green than the moss on the south side. She sees the world in more detail than I do. It's one of the things I love about her, and one of the things that made what happened later so much worse, because she was the first one to notice something was wrong, and she couldn't make anyone else understand what she was noticing. We set up camp that first evening on a flat section of ground just above the creek bank, sheltered on 3 sides by a gentle curve in the valley wall. The creek was maybe 30 feet below us, close enough that we could hear it constantly. That low rushing sound that becomes background noise so quickly you stop consciously registering it. It just becomes part of the air. We filtered water from the creek using a pump filter, which takes time but works. We ate dinner while the light faded from orange to gray to the deep blue that comes right before full dark in a valley where the hills block the stars on 2 sides. Tyler told a story about a fishing trip he'd taken in college where he'd accidentally hooked a snapping turtle and spent 40 minutes trying to get the hook out without losing a finger. Luke corrected details. Nina laughed at the parts that were actually funny. I sat with my back against a fallen log and listened to the creek and felt, for the first time in months, like the noise in my head had gone quiet. The creek went silent around 8:45 that night. I want to be precise about this, because the precision matters. We had finished eating. The fire was down to coals. Tyler and Luke were cleaning up the cookware in the creek water. Nina and I were sitting side by side on the log, and she had her head leaning against my shoulder, and I was watching the last of the daylight disappear from the sky above the tree line. The creek had been making its sound the entire time, that constant low rush, and then it stopped. Not faded, stopped, like someone had reached over and turned off a recording. The silence was sudden and total and lasted for what I later estimated was about 90 seconds, though in the moment it felt longer than that. I didn't notice it stop. That's the thing that matters, and the thing I didn't understand until much later. I didn't register the absence. What I registered was the return. When the creek sound came back, it hit my ears like someone had clapped with a sudden intrusion into a silence I hadn't consciously entered. I blinked and looked at Nina, and she was already looking at me. Her expression was not frightened, it was alert. The way a nurse looks when a patient's monitor just beeped in a way that doesn't match the pattern. "Did you hear that?" she said. "Hear what?" "It stopped," she said. "The creek. It just stopped." I listened. The creek was making its normal sound. I looked at Tyler and Luke down by the water. They were talking about something, rinsing a pot. I hadn't noticed anything. I looked back at the creek. Water was moving over the rocks the same way it had been moving all day. There was no reason for it to have gone silent. "How long?" I asked her. "I don't know. A minute, maybe. Maybe more. I was just sitting here and then it was quiet, and I thought something was wrong with my ears, and then it started again." I sat with that for a moment. Creeks don't stop. Not without a physical reason. A dam, a blockage, a sudden drop in flow. None of those things were happening here. The water was moving. It had always been moving. But Nina had heard it stop, and Nina doesn't imagine things. I filed it. That's what I do when something doesn't fit. I note it and I put it somewhere in the back of my mind where I can come back to it if it becomes relevant. At the time, it didn't feel relevant. It felt like an oddity, a strange moment in an otherwise normal evening. I told Nina it was probably some kind of acoustic effect. The way sound behaves in valleys can be unpredictable, and she nodded like she accepted that, but she didn't look entirely convinced. We went to bed. I slept well. The creek kept making its sound all night, as far as I could tell. The next morning, Thursday, September 21st, we broke camp and continued along the creek. The weather was clear and cool, the kind of Ozark morning where the air feels clean in a way that city air never does, like breathing something that hasn't been breathed before. Tyler was in high spirits. He'd caught 2 smallmouth bass the evening before and was already talking about where he planned to fish that afternoon. Luke was quieter, as usual, studying the creek bed as we walked, reading the water the way some people read text. It was Nina who noticed the fishing rod. We'd stopped for a water break about 2 hours into the morning's hike at a spot where the creek widened into a shallow pool backed up against a flat rock. Tyler had propped his collapsible fishing rod against a tree the night before when we were setting up camp, leaning it at an angle against the trunk the way you do when you're done with something for the night and don't want to pack it away. It was a habit. He did it every time we stopped long enough to set gear down. This morning, the rod was gone from the tree. It was lying flat in the mud at the base of the bank, about 10 feet from where it had been, the tip end pointing toward the creek, like it had slid or been pushed in that direction. Tyler found it and picked it up and looked at it for a second like it had personally offended him. "Who moved this?" he said. No one had. We'd all been in our tents since 10:30 the night before. Nina and I shared a two-person shelter. Tyler and Luke had their own single-person tents set up on either side of ours. None of us had gotten up in the night, or if we had, none of us remembered it, and none of us would have touched someone else's gear. "Wind, maybe," I said. It was the obvious explanation. The rod was lightweight when collapsed. A gust could have knocked it off the tree and rolled it a few feet. It was the kind of thing that happens and that you don't think about twice unless you're already on edge. And at that point, I wasn't. Not really. Nina's creek silence had registered, but I'd filed it away as an anomaly, not a pattern. One data point doesn't make a pattern. You need at least two. Tyler shrugged and clipped the rod back onto his pack, and we kept moving. But I noticed Nina watching me when I gave the wind explanation, and her expression was that same alert, assessing look from the night before. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I understood what she was thinking. I was thinking it too, underneath the rationalization. But you don't say those things out loud on a trip like this. Not yet. Not until you have a reason to. We hiked through the morning and into the early afternoon, following the creek upstream into narrower country where the valley walls got steeper and the canopy got thicker. The air was cooler down here, held in by the hills, and the humidity sat on your skin like a damp cloth. The creek sound was constant, that rushing white noise that fills the space and makes conversation easier because you don't have to project your voice over silence. Tyler and Luke talked about fishing. Nina and I walked close together and said less than we normally would, which, in hindsight, I think was Nina's way of paying attention to the sound around us without announcing that she was doing it. Around 2 in the afternoon, we were crossing a low ridge that separated two drainage systems, a short climb up and over before the trail dropped back down to another tributary. Tyler was beside me on the ridge, and Luke and Nina were maybe 20 feet behind us on the trail. We were at the top of the ridge, looking down the other side, when Tyler's voice came from the left. Not Tyler's mouth. Tyler was right next to me, his lips closed, his eyes on the trail ahead. But from somewhere off to our left, down a side slope thick with cedar and hickory, a voice that sounded exactly like Tyler said, "Guys, over here, you gotta see this." It was perfect. The cadence, the slight emphasis on guys, the way Tyler says it when he wants your attention, the casual invitation at the end. It sounded like Tyler had spotted something interesting and was calling us over to look at it. My body responded before my brain did. I turned my head toward the sound. My feet started to move in that direction. It was automatic, the way you respond to a familiar voice, especially one that belongs to someone you're with and trust. Then I looked at Tyler. He was standing right there. His mouth was closed. His head had snapped toward the sound at the same time mine had, and his face was doing something I'd never seen it do before. The color had drained out of it, not slowly, the way it does when you feel sick, all at once, like someone had turned off a light behind his skin. "That wasn't me," he said. His voice was flat and quiet in a way Tyler's voice never is. Behind us, Nina had stopped walking. I heard her say, very clearly, "Nobody move." We stood there for maybe 10 seconds. The side slope was thick with trees. The cedar grew close together down there, and the hickory filled the gaps, and the undergrowth was dense enough that you couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet into it. There was nothing visible. No movement, no shape, just trees and shadow and the sound of the creek somewhere below us. Then nothing. No second call, no footsteps, nothing. Luke came up beside Nina. He'd heard it too. All four of us had heard it. He looked at me and said, "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer that fit. The rational options were narrow. Someone else on the trail, calling out, but the voice had been Tyler's voice, not a stranger's. And we hadn't seen anyone else since the trailhead. No other cars when we parked, no boot prints on the trail that weren't ours. And the voice hadn't said hello or excuse me or anything a stranger would say. It had said exactly what Tyler would say in exactly the way Tyler would say it to get us to come toward it. "Poacher, maybe," I said, because I needed to put it somewhere. Someone in the woods who'd heard us talking, mimicking a voice to mess with us. It happened. Hunters did weird things sometimes. People who lived out here did weird things sometimes. It was the most normal explanation available, and I took it, because the alternative was a door I didn't want to open. Nina didn't argue, but she moved closer to me for the rest of the afternoon, and she didn't let more than 5 feet of distance open up between any of us for the remainder of the trip. I noticed. I didn't say anything about it. We made camp that second night in another valley, this one slightly wider, with the creek running along the eastern edge. The fog started coming in around sunset, the way it does in these low places in the Ozarks in late September. It didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in, rising from the creek and the wet ground in thin wisps that thickened as the temperature dropped, until by the time full dark came, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet in every direction. The fog was thick enough to muffle sound, which meant the creek was quieter than it had been the night before, its rushing muted and softened by the moisture in the air. It also meant that headlamps did something strange. They didn't cut through the fog so much as illuminate it, turning the air in front of you into a pale white wall that you could see the surface of, but not through. Everything beyond 15 feet was gone. The trees, the valley walls, the sky, just white. We ate dinner and kept the fire small, not because we needed to conserve wood, but because a big fire and fog feels wrong somehow, like you're advertising your position. Tyler was quieter than usual. The voice on the ridge had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and I could see him working through it the way people do when they want to believe the rational explanation but can't quite get there. Luke was reading a paperback he'd brought, holding it close to the fire to see by. Nina sat next to me with her knees drawn up and her eyes moving slowly through the fog around us, scanning without seeming to scan, watching. I went to bed first, around 10. The fog had thickened further by then, and when I unzipped the shelter and crawled in, the air that followed me inside was cold and damp and smelled like wet bark and creek mud. Nina came in a few minutes later. We lay in our sleeping bags side by side, and the creek made its sound outside, muffled by the fog, and I could hear Tyler and Luke talking quietly by the dying fire. Normal sounds, a normal night. The footsteps started sometime after midnight. I was not fully asleep when they began. I was in that half state where you're aware of your surroundings but not quite conscious enough to track them in real time. The footsteps pulled me up out of that state like a hand grabbing the back of my collar. They were on the creek bank, below our camp, moving along the water's edge. Bipedal, deliberate, not the light, quick steps of an animal moving through brush. These were heavy, placed with care, the way a person walks when they're trying to be quiet but can't entirely manage it because the ground is covered in leaf litter and every step crunches slightly, no matter how carefully you set your foot down. I lay still and listened. The steps moved along the creek bank for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again, but now they were moving up the slope toward the camp. I could hear the angle of it in the sound, the way the footfalls changed as the ground tilted. They came up to the edge of the camp and then stopped again. For maybe 10 seconds, there was nothing. Just the creek and the fog and my own breathing and the sound of Nina breathing beside me. Then the footsteps started circling, not walking past, circling, moving around the perimeter of our camp in a wide loop, maybe 40 feet out, where the fog would have hidden them completely from anyone inside the shelter. I tracked them by sound. They went around the east side, past Tyler's tent, around the back of the camp where the ground sloped up toward the valley wall, down the west side past Luke's tent, and back around toward the creek. One full circle. Then they kept going. A second circle, tighter this time, maybe 30 feet out. Then a third, tighter still. Nina was awake. I could tell by the way her breathing had changed, gone shallow and controlled, the way it does when you're paying very close attention to something and trying not to make noise. I didn't reach for her hand or whisper to her or do any of the things you want to do when you're afraid and lying next to someone you love. I didn't move at all. Moving makes noise. Noise draws attention. I lay there with my hand resting on the bear spray canister I keep inside my sleeping bag, and I listened to something walk around us 3 times in the dark and the fog, and I did not make a sound. The circling stopped on the fourth pass, somewhere near the creek bank on the east side of camp. The footsteps faded, not quickly, but gradually, moving back down toward the water and then away along the creek in the upstream direction until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then silence. Just the creek and the fog and the cold. I did not sleep again that night. Nina didn't either. We lay there until the sky started to lighten, that first gray suggestion of dawn that seeps into the fog from above, and neither of us said a word until we were outside the shelter and the others were awake and the daylight had come in enough to push the fog back to the creek bed. It was Friday, September 22nd. The morning was cold, 42 degrees by the thermometer I carry in my pack pocket. The fog had thinned to a low layer along the creek, but hadn't lifted entirely. We made coffee and ate oatmeal, and Tyler asked if anyone else had heard the footsteps. He had. Luke had too. He'd been lying awake when they started, and had listened to the whole thing, the circling, all of it, 4 people, all awake, all hearing the same thing. That's not a coincidence and it's not imagination. That's something real moving around your camp in the dark. We talked about it plainly, the way you do when you're trying to be rational about something that doesn't lend itself to rationality. I said it could be a person, someone camped nearby who was curious about us and had come to look. Tyler pointed out that we hadn't seen any sign of another camp, no fire smoke, no footprints on the trail, nothing. Luke said the footsteps were too heavy for a normal person moving carefully. Nina said nothing during that conversation. She just sat with her coffee and listened. And when the others had finished talking themselves in circles, she looked at me and said, "We should leave today." I wanted to. Part of me wanted to pack up right then and walk out. But the rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 6 years in the army learning to assess threat levels, pushed back. We had no evidence of actual danger. Footsteps around a camp don't constitute a threat. People do strange things in the woods. It could have been a hunter, a hiker, someone who'd seen our fire the night before and come to investigate in the dark because they were curious, or lonely, or drunk. Leaving on the basis of footsteps felt like an overreaction, and I didn't want to be the person who pulled 4 people out of a trip because of something that might have a completely normal explanation. We stayed. We packed up and kept moving along the creek, heading upstream toward the point where we planned to cross over to the Buffalo River drainage and start the loop back. The day was overcast, the clouds sitting low and gray over the hills, and the fog kept coming back in pockets wherever the creek dipped into a low spot or the valley narrowed. Tyler fished at every pool. Luke walked beside him, quiet and watchful in a way that was different from his usual quiet. Nina stayed close to me. I carried the bear spray in my hand instead of in my pack. Nothing happened during the day. That's important. Whatever had been circling our camp the night before made no appearance in daylight. We hiked for 6 hours, covered good ground, and saw nothing unusual except a black bear about 300 yards away on a hillside, which is normal in that country and which paid no attention to us whatsoever. By late afternoon, we'd reached a good campsite on a wider section of the creek, a flat gravel bar with good drainage and a view upstream and downstream. The fog was already starting to build again as the sun dropped, creeping in from the creek in thin tendrils that would thicken overnight. Tyler left his fishing rod leaning against a tree again that evening. He did it without thinking, out of habit, and none of us said anything about it. We ate dinner. The conversation was lighter than it had been that morning, the way it always is after a full day of hiking when your body is tired and your brain wants to relax. But underneath the lightness, all 4 of us were listening. You could feel it in the way we paused between sentences sometimes, heads tilting slightly, ears tuned to the creek and the fog and the trees around us. Tyler's fishing rod was still against the tree when we went to bed. I checked. Nina woke me at 2:14 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at my watch the moment I was conscious enough to register what had woken me. She had her hand on my arm and she was gripping it tight, not shaking me, just holding on, and her face in the dim glow of her headlamp was a color I have never seen on a person's face before or since. Not white, not pale, something past white, something that looked like the blood had simply stopped being there. "Listen," she whispered. I listened. From outside the shelter, close, maybe 8 feet away, a voice said my name, Nina. It said it in my voice, my exact voice, the way I say her name when I'm waking her up in the morning, which is gently, with a slight upward lift at the end, because she doesn't like to be startled out of sleep, and I learned that early on and adjusted. It was that voice, my voice, saying her name, from outside our shelter, while I was lying right next to her, fully awake, my mouth closed. Nina's grip on my arm tightened. I could feel her pulse through her fingers, fast and hard. I put my hand over hers and squeezed once, a signal. "I'm here. I hear it. Don't move." The voice didn't come again, not immediately. There was a silence that lasted maybe 15 seconds, and in that silence I could hear the fog and the creak and my own heartbeat and nothing else. Then footsteps. Not circling this time, moving slowly along the tree line at the edge of camp, maybe 20 feet away from the shelter, heading in the direction of the creek bank. Nina turned on her headlamp and aimed it at the shelter opening. The beam cut into the fog and illuminated exactly nothing beyond about 12 feet. Fog, trees, darkness. She held the light steady and we both stared at it, and for a long time there was nothing to see. Then she moved the beam slightly to the left, tracking toward the tree line, and there it was. It was standing at the edge of the fog, right where the visibility ended, as if it had positioned itself exactly at the boundary between what we could see and what we couldn't. It was humanoid, tall, taller than any of us, maybe 6.5 feet, maybe more. It was standing still, facing us, and it was wearing Tyler's jacket. Not a jacket like Tyler's. Tyler's jacket. The blue down jacket he'd been wearing all day, the one with the tear near the left pocket that he kept meaning to patch, the one he'd hung on a branch near the creek to dry after he'd gotten it wet that afternoon. It was on this thing, on this shape that was standing in the fog at the edge of our camp, and the jacket fit wrong. The shoulders were too narrow for the way the jacket hung, and the arms were too long, like the thing underneath the jacket was not built the way Tyler was built. The jacket hung on it the way clothes hang on a frame that doesn't match the frame they were made for. Nina's headlamp beam was steady on it. The thing didn't move. It didn't flinch at the light. It just stood there, and I couldn't see a face because the fog and the shadow under whatever was on its head made the top half of it a dark blur, and I couldn't see its hands because they were at its sides, blending into the shadow of the jacket sleeves. It was just standing there, looking at us, the way you look at something you're studying, patient, still, like it had all the time in the world. I grabbed Nina's arm and pulled her back from the shelter opening, and we scrambled out the back, grabbing packs and boots and the bear spray without speaking, moving on pure instinct. Tyler and Luke were already out of their tents. Tyler had his headlamp on and was sweeping it in wide arcs, and his face had the same bloodless look Nina's had had, and Luke had his knife out, which I'd never seen him do before, and he was holding it low at his side, the way someone holds a tool they don't actually know how to use but need to be holding something. "It's at the tree line," I said, low and fast. "East side. Don't look at it. We're going to the water." I'd thought about this, not consciously, not as a plan, but somewhere in the back of my mind during those hours of lying awake the night before, listening to something circle our camp. I'd run through scenarios, and the one that kept coming back was the river. We'd cached a canoe upstream, a mile and a half away, at a point where the creek widened enough to paddle. It was part of the original plan, a contingency route back to the trailhead in case the trail was impassable. I hadn't thought we'd need it. Now it was the only option that made sense. We moved fast and quiet, staying close together, headlamps on low, angling down toward the creek bank and then upstream along the water's edge. The fog was thick enough that I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, but I could hear the creek beside us, and I could follow the sound of it upstream the way you follow a road in the dark. Behind us, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling in the trees, nothing. And that was worse than hearing something, because the silence meant I didn't know where it was. We found the canoe where I'd left it, pulled up on the gravel bar and covered with a tarp. Luke and Tyler flipped it while Nina and I loaded the packs. The water was cold, cold enough that the chill hit my hands the moment I touched the paddle, and the current was gentle but present, pulling us downstream even as we aimed upstream. I sat in the stern and paddled hard. Tyler was in the bow doing the same. Luke and Nina were in the middle, and I could hear Nina's breathing, fast and controlled, the way it sounds when someone is fighting to keep it steady. We paddled for what felt like an hour but was probably 30 minutes. The fog closed in around us, and the creek became a tunnel of white, and the sound of the water and the paddles was all there was. At one point, from somewhere behind us, back where the camp had been, I heard something. It might have been a voice. It might have been the creek playing tricks in the fog. I didn't stop paddling to find out, and I didn't tell the others what I thought I'd heard. because there was nothing to do with that information except be more afraid, and we were already afraid enough. The fog started to thin as we approached the confluence with the main Buffalo River channel. The sky was starting to lighten, that first gray suggestion of dawn, and the fog retreated as the light came in, pulling back toward the creek beds and the low ground and leaving the wider river clear. When we rounded the last bend and saw the takeout point, a gravel beach where the river flattened out near a Forest Service road, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It was like a pressure valve opening. The air felt different here. The light felt different. The fog was gone and the river was wide and open and the sky above it was turning from gray to pale blue. We beached the canoe and sat on the gravel for 10 minutes without speaking. Tyler's hands were shaking. Luke was staring at the water like it had done something to him. Nina was leaning against me with her eyes closed, and I could feel her heart beating through her shoulder where it pressed against mine, still fast but slowing. We drove to the ranger station at Ponca that morning. I filed a report. I kept it factual, and I kept it grounded in things a ranger would take seriously. I said we'd had someone following us through the back country, someone who'd been circling our camp at night, someone who'd taken personal property from our camp, a jacket, and that we'd seen a figure in the fog wearing it. I did not say the figure had used my voice to call Nina's name. I did not say the jacket fit wrong on whatever was wearing it. I did not say that whatever it was had been standing perfectly still in the fog like it was posing for a photograph. I said someone was out there and we wanted it on record. The ranger who took the report was a man named Mr. Hollis, mid-50s, the kind of weathered face that comes from decades of working outdoors. He listened without interrupting. He took notes on a clipboard. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me for a moment in a way that told me he was deciding how much to believe. "We get reports like this from time to time," he said. "Usually it's poachers or cooks using the back country, people who don't want to be seen and go to lengths to make visitors uncomfortable so they'll leave." He paused. "Sometimes it's just animals. Black bears can be curious. They'll come into camp at night and look around." "This wasn't a bear," I said. He nodded like he'd expected me to say that. "I'll have someone run the trail over the next couple days. See if there's any sign of another party in there." He handed me a copy of the report with an incident number on it. "In the meantime, I'd recommend staying out of that drainage for a while." I thanked him, and we left. I know he didn't believe it was a poacher. I know he didn't believe it was a bear. I also know he didn't believe what it actually was, because Mr. Hollis is a practical man who has spent his career in the Ozarks and has probably heard every version of every story that comes out of these hills, and he has learned to write them all down and file them and not lose sleep over them. That's his job. It's a good way to do the job. I don't blame him for it. It has been several months since that trip. Tyler doesn't go anywhere without cell service anymore. He won't say why exactly, but he won't go camping, won't take a road trip to anywhere remote. He stays where his phone has bars. Nina sleeps with a light on now, which she never did before. She says it's because she doesn't like the dark, but that's not true. She's never been afraid of the dark in her life. What she's afraid of is the fog, and the dark is close enough to fog that the distinction doesn't matter much at 2 in the morning. Luke quit fishing. I don't think it's related to what happened. I think it might be. He won't talk about it. I still go into the backcountry. I still sleep under the stars when the weather allows it, but I don't go back to that creek, and I don't go anywhere the fog collects at night. I don't have a good reason for that rule, not one I can articulate to someone who wasn't there. It's just that the fog feels different to me now. It feels like something that has a purpose, not weather, not a natural phenomenon, something that moves the way it moves for a reason, and that reason has something to do with what can hide inside it. There is one thing I have not told anyone, not Tyler, not Luke, not Nina. On the drive back from Ponca, Nina was asleep in the passenger seat, and Tyler and Luke were in the back seat of my truck, and I was on a two-lane highway heading south through the hills, and I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something in the tree line beside the road, a shape standing at the edge of the woods, tall and still, facing the truck. It was there for about 2 seconds before we rounded a curve and it was gone. I don't know if it was the same thing. I don't know if it followed us out of the backcountry or if it was something else entirely or if I imagined it, which is possible, because fear does things to your perception that you can't always trust afterward. But the jacket was gone from the branch where Tyler had hung it. We all saw that. We all saw the figure in the fog wearing it. And if you think about what that means, what it implies about something that takes a piece of clothing from your camp and puts it on and stands in the fog at the edge of your light and watches you, you understand why I don't sleep well when it's quiet outside. Because the quiet might not be quiet. It might be something that stopped the sound the way the creek stopped, and I might not notice until it starts again. If you spend time in the Ozark backcountry, or anywhere the fog comes in thick at night, there is one thing I want you to remember. If you are sitting by a creek or a river and the sound of the water stops and you don't notice it stop, you only notice when it starts again. Something used that silence. It didn't happen on its own. Something made the creek go quiet so it could move without being heard, and it used that window, and by the time the sound came back, it was already close. When that happens, don't wait for morning. Don't rationalize it. Get to open water, get moving, and don't stop until you can see the river from bank to bank and there is nowhere for anything to hide. The creek always sounds the same afterward. That's the worst part. It just keeps going, the same as it always has, like nothing happened at all. Like it doesn't know what moved through the silence it made, or like it does know and it doesn't care. Greg had been gone 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when he left, and I checked it again when the thing wearing his voice told me he'd fallen. 11 minutes. Greg had radioed me 4 of those minutes in, alive, complaining about the mud on the trail up to camera 7. So whatever spoke to me after that, that was not Greg. But I need to back up, because if I start there, you don't understand why I didn't just go up the ridge looking for him. You don't understand why I stayed put. And the reason I stayed put is the reason I'm still alive. And the reason I'm still alive is because Greg taught me over 12 years of working in the backcountry together that the most dangerous thing a person can do in a remote place is assume they know what's making a sound. My name is Ryan. I've been a wildlife biologist for 9 years, most of that time spent in the Pacific Northwest and Southeast Alaska doing camera trap surveys for state and federal research stations. It's lonely work, it's repetitive work. You hike in, you check cameras, you swap memory cards, you note the conditions, and you hike out. Most days, the most exciting thing you see is a black bear scratching its back on a tree at 3 in the morning on a trail cam image. I don't mind the solitude. I grew up in it. There's a rhythm to being alone in old growth forests that most people can't access. And once you find it, silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling full. Greg was my senior researcher, 58 years old, built like someone who'd spent decades carrying packs through rough country, which he had. He'd been working the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska since before I'd finished my undergraduate degree. He knew the forest the way a mechanic knows an engine, not just the parts, but the sounds, the way it breathed in different weather, the way it changed when something was off. He didn't talk much about any of this. He just noticed things, and when he spoke up, you listened, because in 9 years he'd never been wrong about the forest. Aisha was the third person on this trip, and she was the one who surprised me the most, though not in the way you might expect. She was a grad student, 26, working on her thesis in soil microbiology. She'd asked to tag along on the camera check run because the terrain we were covering had some interesting geological features she wanted to sample. She was sharp, skeptical in a way that I respected, the kind of person who needed evidence before she'd accept an explanation, and who wasn't impressed by stories or atmosphere. She didn't believe in the supernatural. She told me that on the first day, matter of factly, the way someone states their height or their blood type. I don't do ghosts, she said. I do data. By the third night in that cabin, she wasn't so sure anymore. We were based out of a small research station cabin deep in the Tongass, accessible only by helicopter, no roads, no trails wide enough for an ATV. The nearest other human being was a bush pilot who serviced the station once a month, and even he didn't always make the trip in bad weather. The cabin itself was modest, a single room with a wood stove, two cots, a workbench where we kept the equipment, and a small attached storage shed for supplies. It had been used by researchers for over 20 years, and it showed. The walls were covered in layers of tacked up notes and old trail maps and faded photographs of bears and elk that previous crews had left behind. It felt lived in. It felt safe. Southeast Alaska in early October is one of the wettest places on Earth. The rain comes in almost constantly, not always heavy, sometimes just a fine mist that hangs in the air and coats everything in a thin layer of moisture, but it's always there. The old growth cedar and hemlock forest holds the water like a sponge, and the constant drip from the canopy creates a layered sound that fills the air the way white noise fills a room. A thousand tiny impacts on leaves and bark and moss in the forest floor, all blending together into something that becomes the background of everything. You stop hearing it consciously after the first day. It just becomes the sound of being there. We arrived by helicopter on Monday, October 2nd, 2023. The pilot set us down in a small clearing about 200 yards from the cabin, and we unloaded gear and supplies while the engine idled, and then he was gone, and it was just the three of us and the rain and the trees. Greg had been here dozens of times. He moved through the cabin like someone returning to a familiar room, checking the wood stove, the water supply, the emergency radio. Aisha set up her equipment on the workbench with careful, practiced hands. I started organizing the camera check schedule on the map pinned to the wall, marking the locations of the 14 trail cameras spread across a 6 square mile grid. The first morning, Tuesday, October 3rd, I did my rounds alone. Greg stayed at the cabin to do equipment maintenance. Aisha went out to collect her soil samples. I took the Eastern Loop 5 cameras, about a 4 mile circuit through country that was wet and steep and beautiful in a way that made you understand why people spent their lives working in places like this. The cedar trees out there are enormous. Some of them are over 1,000 years old, and the trunks are so wide that two people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The moss on the forest floor is ankle deep in places, so thick and soft that your boots sink into it silently with every step. The air smells like wet wood and cold earth and something faintly sweet that I've never been able to identify. Maybe the moss itself, maybe something decomposing underneath it. I checked cameras 1 through 5. Most of them had the usual traffic, deer, a couple of elk, a black bear on camera 3 that had been active all week, normal stuff. But camera 4 was different. Camera 4 was mounted on a cedar trunk at about chest height, facing a natural game trail that ran along a drainage about 2 miles from the cabin. I'd set it up 6 weeks earlier and hadn't checked it since. When I opened the housing and pulled the memory card, the indicator light showed 43 images since my last visit. That was high, but not unusual for a trail this active. I slotted the card into my field reader and started scrolling through the images on the small screen. Most of them were standard. Deer moving through at dusk and dawn, a spike elk at 2 in the morning, a raven sitting on a rock in broad daylight, which always looks vaguely suspicious on a trail cam, but isn't. I scrolled past them methodically, the way I'd done it 1,000 times before, not really looking for anything specific, just checking for the presence or absence of animal activity that would tell me whether the camera placement was working. And then I hit the image time-stamped 3:14 a.m. It stopped me, not because of what I expected to see, but because of what I didn't. The image showed the trail in front of the camera, lit by the infrared flash, the cedar trunks on either side, rendered in that flat gray white that IR photography produces. And standing directly in front of the camera, maybe 6 feet back, was a figure. It was bipedal, human height. That much was clear, but the rest of it wasn't. The IR flash should have resolved the human figure cleanly at that distance. I've seen hundreds of trail cam images of people, hikers who wandered into the frame, hunters, researchers from other stations. They come out sharp and clear, every detail visible, jacket texture, boot soles, the grain of skin on a hand if it's close enough. This figure didn't resolve like that. It looked blurred. Not motion blurred, the way an animal looks when it moves during the exposure. Blurred like the camera couldn't decide what it was looking at. The outline was there, a shape, standing upright, facing the camera, but the details inside that outline were wrong, smeared, like someone had taken a photograph of a person and then smudged it with their thumb before it dried. I stared at that image for a long time, longer than I should have, probably. The screen on the field reader is small, and the light was bad under the canopy, and I told myself I was just trying to make out details that the image quality wouldn't support. Camera malfunction, moisture on the lens, an artifact in the sensor. All of those things happen, especially in wet conditions like this, and all of them can produce strange images that look like something but aren't. I deleted the image. I noted it in my field log as a possible sensor anomaly. I pulled the card, replaced it with a fresh one, and kept moving. I didn't tell Greg or Aisha about it that evening. I don't know why. Part of it was that I had already rationalized it, filed it away as a technical glitch, and bringing it up would have meant reopening that filing and examining it more closely than I wanted to. Part of it was something else, something I didn't fully understand at the time, but that I've thought about a lot since. A feeling that showing someone else that image describing it even would have changed something, made it more real, and I wasn't ready for that. The rain stopped on Wednesday, October 4th. I noticed it around mid-morning, not because I was paying attention to the weather, but because the sound changed. The constant layered drip that had been filling the air since we arrived just wasn't there anymore. The forest went quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a dry day. Something compressed, like the air itself had been wrung out and left to hang there, still and heavy and waiting. Greg noticed it before I did. We were at the cabin, working on equipment, and he set down the radio he was repairing and looked up at the ceiling like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then he looked at me. Rain stopped, he said. Yeah, I said, finally. He shook his head, slow, deliberate. No, not finally. That's not. This isn't right. I looked at him. Greg didn't say things like that lightly. He was the most measured person I'd ever worked with. 12 years of reading this forest had given him an instinct for it that went beyond experience into something closer to intuition, and when that instinct told him something was off, it was off. It's October, he said, in the Tongass. It doesn't stop raining in October. Not like this. Not all at once. He was right. I'd checked the weather data before the trip. October in southeast Alaska averages over 14 inches of rainfall. The rain doesn't stop for days at a stretch. It slows, sometimes. It shifts from heavy to mist. But it doesn't just cease. Not cleanly, not completely, but it had, and the forest felt different without it. Quieter than quiet. The kind of silence that has weight. Aisha came back from her sampling around noon and noticed it immediately. She stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment, looking out at the trees, and said, "When did it stop?" "Couple hours ago," I said. "Huh." She tilted her head, listening. "Feels weird." "Yeah," Craig said from across the room. He didn't look up from what he was doing. "It does." We didn't talk about it much after that. There wasn't much to say. The weather had done something unusual. Unusual things happen in nature. You note them and you move on. But the silence sat on the cabin like a lid, and none of us were entirely comfortable underneath it. That evening, around 7, Aisha went outside to wash her sampling equipment in the rain barrel. Greg and I were inside. Greg reading, me reviewing the day's camera data on my laptop. The cabin door was closed but not locked. There was no real reason to lock it out here. There was no one to lock it against. About 10 minutes after she went out, I heard singing. It came from outside, a woman's voice, soft, almost indistinct, like someone humming a lullaby while doing something with their hands. It was gentle. It was close. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond the rain barrel, maybe 20 feet from the cabin door. I looked up from my laptop. Greg was still reading. His expression hadn't changed. I listened harder. The singing continued, soft, melodic, unhurried. It had no words I could make out, just a tune that repeated in a pattern I couldn't quite follow, like it kept shifting right before I could lock onto the melody. Greg, I said. He looked up. Hmm? Do you hear that? He listened, tilted his head, shook it slowly. Hear what? Singing. Outside. He listened again, longer this time. Then, no, nothing. I sat with that for a second. The singing was still there, clear as anything. A woman's voice, close, outside the cabin, in a place where there was no woman within 40 miles. Then the cabin door opened and Aisha came back inside and the singing stopped. Cut off clean, like a switch had been flipped. She set her equipment down and dried her hands on a towel and looked at me and said, "What? Did you hear someone singing out there?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked her something strange. "No, just me washing the bottles." She paused. "Why?" I told her what I'd heard. She listened, then looked at Greg, who confirmed he hadn't heard anything either. She shrugged, not dismissive, but genuinely puzzled. "Acoustic thing, maybe," she said. "The way the trees channel sound out here can be, I don't know, weird." I nodded. I accepted that. I filed it. But I noticed Greg watching me after that, in a way he hadn't before. Not worried, exactly. Attentive, like he was keeping track of something. Thursday, October 5th, was the day the radio call happened. We had a system for camera checks. When someone went out alone to service a camera, they carried a two-way radio and checked in at regular intervals every 5 minutes if the terrain was easy, every 10 if it was rough. There was a safety protocol Greg had established years ago, back when he'd once gone down a slope in bad weather and broken his wrist and had to wait 6 hours for the next scheduled satellite phone check-in to get help. After that, he didn't let anyone work alone without a radio check system in place. Greg went out that morning to service cameras 6, 7, and 8, all of them up on a ridge about 800 yards northeast of the cabin. Aisha and I stayed at the cabin. She was working on her samples. I was cleaning and recalibrating equipment. It was a normal morning. The sky was overcast but dry. The rain still hadn't come back, which bothered Greg more than he let on. He radioed in at the 4-minute mark. I was sitting at the workbench with the radio on the bench next to me, and his voice came through clear and sharp the way it always does when conditions are good. "At camera 6, he said. "Card's full. Swapping now. Trail's a mess up here, Muds." A brief pause. The sound of him moving, boots on wet ground. "Yeah, it's bad. Anyway, checking in. Copy," I said. "Take your time." "Yeah," he said, and the radio clicked off. That was normal. That was exactly how Greg sounded on a radio check clipped, slightly annoyed by the interruption, already thinking about the next task. I went back to what I was doing. Aisha was at the other end of the cabin, pipetting something into a row of vials, her brow furrowed in concentration. 7 minutes passed, then 8, then 9. I wasn't watching the clock consciously, but I was aware of the time, the way you're always aware of time when someone is out alone and on a check-in schedule. The next check-in should have come at the 9 or 10-minute mark. It didn't. I set down what I was doing and picked up the radio. "Greg, check in." Nothing. Static. The low hiss of an open channel with no one transmitting. Greg, this is Ryan. Check in, please. Nothing. I tried again at the 11-minute mark. Nothing. My stomach had started to tighten. Not panic. Not yet. But that first edge of it, the place where concern sharpens into something more focused. I was about to try it a fourth time when the radio crackled and a voice said, Ryan, yeah, I'm here. It was Greg's voice, or it sounded like Greg's voice. The cadence was close. The tone was in the right range, but something about it was off. I couldn't have told you exactly what, not at first. It just didn't sit right, like hearing a song you know played in a slightly different key, close enough to recognize, wrong enough to notice. Greg, I said, where are you? You missed your check-in. A pause, slightly too long. Then, yeah, I I fell, hurt my ankle on the way back from 7. Can someone can someone come up? I stared at the radio. My hand had gone still around it. That wasn't how Greg talked. Not when he was hurt, not when he was in pain or stressed or dealing with a problem. Greg, in a crisis, was blunt and precise. He'd give you coordinates, not vague directions. He'd say left ankle, possible fracture, trail marker at the fork, not can someone come up, with that trailing, uncertain quality. The voice on the radio sounded like someone who had heard Greg talk and was trying to reproduce the sound of it without understanding the rhythm underneath. I set the radio down carefully. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Aisha, I said. She looked up from her work. She saw my face. What's wrong? Something's wrong with Greg's radio. He's not responding normally. What do you mean, not normally? I told her what I'd heard. The missed check-in. The voice that sounded like Greg but wasn't quite. The way it had asked for help in a way Greg would never ask. She listened, and as I talked, I watched her expression shift from curiosity to something harder, something colder. Play it back, she said. It's a two-way. There's no playback. She nodded, thought for a moment, then, don't answer it again. What if he's actually hurt? Then he'll radio again, she said, and it'll sound like him, the real him. She paused. You said it didn't sound right. It didn't. Then don't answer it. We sat in the cabin for another 20 minutes, the radio between us on the bench, and neither of us touched it. The silence in the forest pressed against the windows like something physical. At 11:42, I heard footsteps outside. Real footsteps, heavy and uneven, the sound of someone moving carefully on wet ground, and then the door opened and Greg walked in. He was fine. Muddy, sweating slightly despite the cold, but fine. Both ankles intact. No limp, no sign of injury of any kind. He set his pack down and looked at us and immediately said, What happened? You two look like you've seen a ghost. You missed your check-in, I said. No, I didn't. I called at 4 minutes. I was going to call again at 10, but I was swapping the card on 7 and lost track. I was about to radio when I started heading back. He paused, looked at the radio on the bench. Did I not come through? You came through at 11 minutes, I said, but it wasn't you. Greg went very still, the way he goes still when the forest tells him something he doesn't want to hear. He picked up the radio and looked at it like it had betrayed him. Then he looked at me. What did it say? I told him, word for word. The hesitation, the can someone come up, the tone that was almost right but wasn't. Greg listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set the radio down and stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly, my radio was on the whole time. I had it clipped to my chest. I didn't transmit after the 4-minute mark. He looked up. So something else used my frequency. The room got very cold after that. Not the temperature stayed the same. But something in the air shifted, the way it shifts when you understand something you can't ununderstand. Aisha had stopped breathing for a second, I noticed. Then she started again, slow and controlled, the way someone breathes when they're trying to keep themselves together. That's not possible, she said. but her voice didn't have the conviction it usually did, the data over atmosphere conviction. Something had cracked in it. No, Greg said, it's not. We ate dinner that night in near silence. The wood stove was going. The cabin was warm. The door was locked. Greg had locked it without comment, which told me more about how seriously he was taking this than anything he'd said out loud. Outside, the forest was dark and still and dry. The rain still hadn't come back. The absence of it felt deliberate now, felt chosen. Around 9:30, Aisha said she was tired and lay down on her cot. Greg and I sat by the stove, not talking much, each of us turning things over in our own heads. I was thinking about the camera image I'd deleted, the figure that hadn't resolved correctly in the IR. I hadn't told either of them about it, and now I was regretting that. But bringing it up felt like adding fuel to something that was already burning in a direction I couldn't control. It was close to 10 when the singing started again. It came from outside, the same voice as before, soft, melodic, a woman's voice humming something without words. It was close, close enough that it felt like it was coming from just outside the cabin wall, maybe 10 feet away, maybe less. I looked at Greg. He was already looking at me. His face was very calm, the way it gets when he's processing something dangerous and doesn't want to show it. He held up one finger. Listen. I listened. The singing continued, gentle, patient, almost lullaby-like in its rhythm. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, and then it changed. It became Aisha's voice, not a woman singing generically. Aisha. Her specific voice, her specific way of carrying a tune, because Aisha sang all the time, while she worked, while she walked, little fragments of songs she'd grown up with, half-remembered melodies that she hummed without thinking about it. I'd heard her do it a dozen times over the past 3 days. It was one of the things I'd noticed about her, how unself-conscious it was, how natural. This was that voice, singing that way, from outside the locked cabin door. Greg stood up, slow, deliberate. He moved to the door and put his hand flat against it, not on the handle, just against the wood, like he was feeling for something on the other side. He stood there for a long time, listening. Then he turned back to me and shook his head. Just once. Don't open it, he said. On the cot across the room, Aisha stirred. She sat up, blinking, and looked at us. What? What time is it? Listen, I said. She listened. Her face changed. The singing was still going, her voice, her melody, from outside the door, 10 feet away from where she was sitting. She heard herself singing from a place where she wasn't standing. Her mouth opened slightly. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, very still, and listened to her own voice come from somewhere it had no right to be. The singing went on for another 2 minutes. Then it stopped. All at once, clean cut, the way the rain had stopped, like a switch. None of us moved for a long time after that. The cabin was quiet. The forest outside was quiet. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. Finally, Aisha said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, That was me. No, Greg said. It wasn't. We didn't sleep that night. Not really. We sat or lay awake in the cabin, with every light on the overhead bulb, the 2 desk lamps, a flashlight pointed at the ceiling for good measure, and we waited for something to happen. Nothing did. The singing didn't come back. There were no footsteps outside, no knocking, no voices, just the silence and the dry forest and the three of us breathing in a small room, waiting for dawn. When the light finally came, gray and cold and grudging through the cabin windows, Greg was the first one up. He put on his boots and his jacket and unlocked the door and stepped outside. Aisha and I followed, standing in the doorway, watching him move around the perimeter of the cabin with his eyes on the ground. He found the prints about halfway around. They were in the mud beside the rain barrel, where the ground was soft and wet and held detail the way sand does. Footprints, barefoot. The impressions were deep, deep enough that whatever made them had weight behind them, and they were large. larger than any of our feet. Greg crouched beside one and studied it without touching it, the way he studies animal sign, reading the shape and the depth and the way the mud had been displaced. Barefoot, he said, almost to himself, in this mud, in this cold. The mud was close to freezing. The temperature had dropped overnight into the low 30s. Walking barefoot in that ground would have been painful, dangerous, even. No sane person would do it. The prince circled the cabin once a single loop, close to the walls, close enough that whoever made them could have touched the wood by reaching out. Then they led away from the cabin in a straight line toward the tree line about 60 yards out. Greg followed them with his eyes, not his feet, staying off the trail of prints. They walked straight across the open ground, no hesitation, no deviation, and then they stopped. They stopped at the edge of a flat rock outcrop where the ground changed from mud to stone. The last print pressed deep into the mud right at the border, and then there was nothing. Rock doesn't hold footprints. There was no way to tell where they'd gone after that, into the trees, up the rock, anywhere. Greg stood up and looked at the tree line for a long time. Then he looked at me. "We stay in the cabin today," he said. "We don't go out. We don't open the door after dark." "The helicopter isn't until Saturday," I said. "I know." Friday passed slowly. We stayed inside. Greg kept the radio on, monitoring the frequency, but nothing came through except static. Aisha worked on her samples at the bench, but she wasn't really working. She kept stopping, setting down her pipette, and listening. Listening for what? I don't think she could have said. Just listening. Greg read, or pretended to read. I sat by the window and watched the tree line and thought about the image I deleted from camera 4. That evening, after dark, I pulled out my field reader and slotted the memory card from camera 4, the one I'd replaced on Tuesday. The card I'd put in fresh, the one that had been recording since then. I wanted to check if there was anything new on it. But more than that, I wanted to check something else. The card I'd pulled on Tuesday, the one with the image I deleted, I'd stored it in a labeled case in my pack, the way I always do. Deleted images can sometimes be recovered from memory cards if you haven't written over them. I wanted to try. I plugged the old card into the reader and ran a recovery scan. It's a simple process. The software looks for file headers that are still on the card even after deletion. It takes a few minutes. It found nothing. Nothing recoverable. Nothing at all. The card showed no record of a deleted file. No ghost of a file header. No trace that an image had ever existed in that slot. It was as if the image had never been captured, as if camera 4 had simply skipped that timestamp entirely, jumping from the image before 3:14 a.m. to the image after it, with nothing in between. I stared at the reader for a long time. Then I put the card away and didn't tell Greg or Aisha what I had found. Some things, once you say them out loud, become real in a way that changes everything around them. I wasn't ready for that. I'm not sure I'm ready for it now. And the helicopter came Saturday morning, on schedule, right on time, and it was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. The mechanical thrum of rotors cutting through the quiet like a blade through fabric. Ordinary and loud and human and real. We had our gear packed and waiting before it touched down. We didn't linger. We loaded, we lifted off, and we watched the cabin shrink below us until the trees swallowed it and there was nothing to see but forest stretching out in every direction, wet and dark and still. I filed the incident report with the research station director the following Monday. I kept it factual. Radio interference on an open frequency during a solo camera check. An unexplained vocalization outside the cabin on 2 separate nights. Barefoot footprints in the mud surrounding the structure in sub-freezing temperatures. I did not use words like mimicry or entity or anything that would have made the report sound like something other than what it was, a record of events that didn't have a clean explanation. The director read it, asked a couple of questions, and said he'd flag it for the next team scheduled to use that station. Probably an animal, he said. Something curious. Maybe. I don't know what it was. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a malfunction, or an echo, or a trick of the acoustics, or anything else that fits neatly into the categories we use to explain the world. Greg doesn't talk about it. He went back to the Tongass 2 months later for a different project, a different station, a different part of the forest. He hasn't mentioned the cabin or the radio or any of it, but I noticed the last time I saw him that he carries a second radio now, a backup. He didn't used to do that. Aisha stopped singing. That's the thing I think about the most when I think about what happened out there. She used to sing all the time while she worked, while she walked, little unconscious melodies that came out of her without her noticing. It was part of who she was, part of how she moved through the world. And now she doesn't. She hasn't sung once since we got back. I asked her about it once, carefully, not wanting to push. She looked at me for a long moment and said, very quietly, I can't. I don't want it to hear me. She didn't say what it was. She didn't need to. I still do camera trap work. I still go into remote places alone or close to alone. But there is one thing I do differently now. One rule I have that I didn't have before. And it comes directly from what happened on that ridge when Greg's radio spoke in his voice and asked me to come find him. If you are working in the backcountry with someone and they radio you and the voice sounds like them, but something about it is wrong, too smooth, too rehearsed, missing the specific way they sound when they're actually stressed or hurt or in a hurry, do not go to them. Do not answer. Stay where you are. Stay in your structure if you have one. Wait. Let them come to you. Because if it's really them, they'll find you or they'll radio again. And this time it will sound right and you'll know. And if it doesn't, if the voice keeps coming back, keeps trying different words, keeps adjusting, getting closer to right, but never quite landing on it, then it's not them. It's something that has heard them talk and is trying on the sound of it the way you try on a coat, and it wants you to come out into the dark where it's waiting. Don't stay where you are. Keep the light on. Wait for morning. And when morning comes and the person you were waiting for walks through the door looking confused and uninjured and wondering why you look so afraid, you'll know. You'll know exactly what was out there wearing their voice while they were somewhere else entirely. And you'll never hear radio the same way again. I have surveyed 11,000 acres of wilderness in my career, 11,000 acres of line and bearing and elevation change, measured down to the inch, recorded in logs that no one reads, but that exist because the land requires it. I have never once, in all of that work, questioned whether the ground I was measuring was paying attention to me. Until that night in the big thicket, when Sam's voice asked me to open the truck door from the outside, and Sam was locked in the passenger seat, 6 inches from my hand. My name is Eli. I've been an independent land surveyor for 14 years, mostly contract work for timber companies and development firms across East Texas. It's not glamorous work. It's not the kind of work that gets you out of bed in the morning with any particular excitement. But it's precise work, and I'm a precise person, and there is something deeply satisfying about taking a piece of ground that exists only as a line on a map and turning it into something real, a boundary, a measurement, a fact. Numbers don't lie. Instruments don't change their minds. The theodolite shows you what's there, and you write it down, and that's that. Or at least that's what I believed for 14 years. Until the big thicket showed me that some ground doesn't want to be written down at all. Sam was my survey partner, had been for 3 years. He was a former ranch hand out of a small town west of Nacogdoches, the kind of man who moved through the outdoors like he'd been born in it, which, in a sense, he had. Quiet, steady, not the type to fill silence with talk just to hear himself. When Sam said something, it mattered, because he didn't say much. He had a way of reading the land that was different from mine, not technical, not instrument based, but intuitive in a way I respected even if I couldn't fully explain it. He'd stop sometimes in the middle of a transect and just stand there looking at the ground and say something like, "This spot feels heavy," or "Something moved through here recently." And he was usually right. Not always, but often enough that I'd learned to listen when he spoke up. The job came through the timber company office in Lufkin, Texas in mid-November of 2022. A boundary survey on a contested parcel deep inside the Big Thicket National Preserve. It's about 200 acres that a timber company had mineral rights to, but whose surface boundaries hadn't been legally surveyed in over 40 years. The old survey was done with methods that didn't meet current standards, and before any logging permits could move forward, someone had to go in and do it right. That someone was me. It was a 2-week job, maybe more, depending on terrain. The parcel was in a section of the thicket that I hadn't worked before, deep enough into the preserve that the nearest paved road was a 40-minute drive on county roads, and even that road turned to mud in wet weather. We'd be camping in my truck, a 1-ton pickup with a slide-in camper unit on the bed, the kind of setup that's not comfortable but is functional. There was a propane heater, small stove, 2 cots that folded out from the walls, and enough storage for 2 weeks of food and water. We filed daily check-ins with the timber company office via satellite phone, standard protocol. If we missed 2 consecutive check-ins, they'd flag it. We drove out from Lufkin on Monday, November 13th. The weather was overcast but dry, the sky a flat gray ceiling that sat low over the pines and made the landscape feel compressed, like the world had a lid on it. East Texas in late November has a particular quality to it that's different from the rest of the state. The humidity doesn't drop the way it does in the hill country or the panhandle. It stays, even when it's cold, a damp heaviness in the air that settles on everything, your jacket, your equipment, the inside of the cab, and the smell. Wet pine needles and decomposing leaf litter and that dark fungal smell that comes from soil that's been wet for a long time. It's not unpleasant, it's just constant. It gets into your clothes and stays there. The Big Thicket is one of the oldest forests in North America. Parts of it have been continuous old growth for 10,000 years. The trees out there, longleaf pine, loblolly, water oak, hickory, some of them are enormous. Their trunks broad and rough-barked. Their canopy so thick overhead that even at midday, the light on the forest floor is dim and filtered. The understory is dense in places. Ferns and palmetto and yopon holly growing thick enough that you can't see more than 30 or 40 feet in any direction. It's quiet in there in a way that's different from the quiet of open country. It's not empty quiet, it's full quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight and texture, like the forest is holding something in and not telling you what it is. We set up camp on the first evening at the edge of the survey parcel, in a small clearing where the ground was relatively flat and dry. I parked the truck facing out, an old habit. Always point the vehicle toward your exit, and we ran a quick visual of the surrounding terrain before the light went. Pines everywhere, a slight slope to the east, dropping toward a creek we could hear but not see through the understory. Dead leaves on the ground, thick and dry, the kind that crunch under your boots with every step and make it impossible to move quietly. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, and something faintly sweet underneath, like sap or rot, though I couldn't tell which. We ate dinner in the camper that first night, the propane heater ticking away, and went over the survey plan. I had the parcel mapped on paper, the old boundary lines, the landmarks referenced in the original survey, the GPS waypoints I'd plotted from satellite imagery before the trip. Sam studied the map alongside me, tracing the boundary lines with one finger, nodding occasionally. He knew how to read a survey map the way a mechanic reads a schematic. not from training. From years of working the ground and learning what the lines meant in real terms. 200 acres, he said, looking at the map. Give or take. Deep in. Yeah. He folded the map and set it on the bench, looked at me for a moment, then, all right, early start, 5:30. Fine. We slept well that first night. The camper was warm. The heater hummed. Outside, the forest did what forests do at night, small sounds, the occasional crack of a branch settling, the distant call of a barred owl somewhere in the canopy. Normal, unremarkable. I didn't dream. The first 2 days were routine. We set up the theodolite at the first benchmark, sighted the initial bearing, and started driving stakes along the eastern boundary line. The work is slow by nature. You move maybe 200 yards in a good hour, stopping every 50 feet or so to take a reading, drive a stake, record the data. Sam handled the physical side, driving stakes, clearing sight lines through the understory, carrying the equipment between setups. I handled the instrument and the numbers. We didn't talk much while we worked. We didn't need to. The rhythm of the job filled the silence. The GPS stakes started giving me trouble on Wednesday, November 15th, day 3. It wasn't dramatic at first. A reading that was off by 3 feet on the northern boundary. I checked the theodolite, the optical instrument, no satellite involved, and the theodolite said my paper calculation was correct. The GPS stake was wrong, 3 feet east of where it should have been. I assumed canopy interference. That's the standard explanation when GPS drifts in forested terrain. The satellite signal bounces off the canopy in the trees and arrives at the receiver, slightly displaced. It happens all the time in old-growth forest. You account for it. You cross-reference with optical readings. You move on. Except it kept happening. Not on every stake. Only on the stakes. I was driving in one specific section of the parcel, in a stretch of about 300 yards along the western boundary, where the forest was particularly dense, and the canopy closed overhead like a roof. Every GPS reading in that section was off 3 to 4 feet, always in the same direction, always inconsistent with what the theodolite showed. The theodolite was right, the GPS was wrong, and it was wrong only there. I spent an extra hour on Wednesday afternoon trying to figure it out. I moved the GPS receiver to different positions. I waited for it to acquire more satellites. I tried it in the open, 50 yards from the problem zone, and it worked perfectly. I walked back into the zone, and it drifted again. 3 feet, 4 feet, like something in that specific piece of ground was pushing the signal sideways. Sam watched me work through this without comment for a while. Then he walked over to where I was standing, in the middle of the problem zone, and looked down at the ground. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, very still, the way he gets when he's reading something. "This ground feels wrong," he said. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He shrugged one shoulder. "I don't know. It just does. Something about it." I nodded. I filed it. Sam said things like that's sometimes impressionistic, intuitive observations that didn't translate into anything I could put in a report. I respected his instincts, but I couldn't build a survey on feelings. I had a technical explanation for the GPS drift, canopy interference. It fit. It was the simplest answer. I took it and kept working. That night, around 11, we were in the camper with the heater running and the windows fogged from the humidity. Sam was reading a paperback, some Western novel he'd picked up at a gas station in Lufkin. I was updating my field log by the small reading light above the bench. It was quiet outside. The dead leaves had stopped crunching hours ago, when we'd stopped moving through them. The forest was doing its nighttime thing, small sounds, settling wood, the occasional rustle of something small in the understory. Then we heard footsteps. They were close, maybe 20 feet from the camper, passing along the east side, moving north to south, heavy, deliberate. The dead leaves under them crunched with each step in a way that told me the thing making them had real weight behind it. Bipedal, two-footed, step, crunch, evenly spaced, unhurried. Sam set down his book, looked at the wall of the camper, toward the sound. Deer? He said. I listened. The footsteps continued, steady and measured, moving past us. Deer don't walk like that, I said. He nodded slowly, because he knew I was right. A deer moves through dead leaves with a particular cadence light, quick, with occasional pauses and direction changes. It stumbles. It startles. It doesn't place its feet with care. Whatever was walking past our camper was placing its feet with care, one step at a time, deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was putting each foot and why. The footsteps faded as whatever it was moved away from us, continuing south into the trees, then silence, just the heater ticking. Sam picked his book back up, but he didn't read. He sat there holding it and staring at the wall for a long time before he finally set it down and lay back on his cot without another word. I didn't sleep much that night. Thursday, November 16th, started cold. The temperature had dropped overnight into the low 40s, and the humidity turned the cold into something that got into your bones and stayed there. We ate breakfast in the camper coffee, eggs on the small stove, and went back out to work. The GPS drift was still happening in the problem zone. I logged it, noted the theodolite readings as the authoritative measurements, and kept driving stakes. We were making decent progress on the western boundary. Another day or two, and we'd turn the corner onto the southern line. It was Sam who found the stake. We were setting up for the mid-morning theodolite shot about halfway through the problem zone when Sam came back from clearing a sight line through a patch of Yopon holly and stopped. He was standing about 10 feet off our transect line, looking down at something in the leaf litter. I walked over. It was a surveyor's stake, not one of mine. Mine are steel, bright orange tops, driven with a sledgehammer and GPS positioned to within a fraction of an inch. This one was wooden. A hand-carved dowel, maybe an inch and a half across, with a flat top that had been painted orange at some point in the past but had faded to a washed-out peach color, like something you'd find in a junk drawer. It was driven into the ground about 6 inches deep, set right in the middle of our transect line, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Sam crouched beside it and looked at it without touching it. That's not ours, he said. No. Old. I crouched beside him. He was right. The wood was dry and brittle, the kind of dry that comes from years of exposure, not days. The paint had worn down to almost nothing on the edges. The top of the stake had a slight weathering to it, the wood grain raised and rough from sun and rain over what looked like a long time, a very long time. I pulled it out of the ground carefully, the way you handle something that might tell you something. It came out easily. The soil around it was loose, like it had been driven in recently despite how old the stake itself looked. The wood at the bottom, where it had been in the ground, was dry. Not damp, not soft. Dry, the way wood gets when it's been sitting in a dry place for years, not pushed into wet soil that morning. Someone else surveyed this ground, Sam said. Maybe, I said. I turned the stake over in my hands, looking at it. There were no markings on it besides the faded paint. No stamp, no date, no surveyor's initials. Nothing that would tell me who put it there or when. That evening, back in the camper, I pulled up the county records on my satellite phone. It took a while. The connection was slow and the database was old, but I found the parcel history. Ownership transfers going back to the 1950s. Mineral rights separated from surface rights in 1978. The original boundary survey, done in 1981, were referenced in the records, but with no attached documentation beyond the basic bearing descriptions. No other surveys, no record of any survey crew accessing this parcel between 1981 and now. No permits, no access logs, nothing that would explain a hand-carved wooden stake sitting in the middle of our transect line. I set the phone down, looked at Sam. He was watching me from his cot, waiting. Nothing, I said. No prior survey on record. He nodded, like he'd expected that. He didn't say anything else, and neither did I. We sat in the quiet of the camper and listened to the heater tick and thought about a stake that shouldn't have been there, driven into ground that no one had surveyed in over 40 years. Made of wood, so dry it could have been decades old, but pushed into soil that was loose and fresh. I kept the stake, set it on the bench next to my field log. I'd photograph it in the morning and note it in my report. It was an anomaly. Anomalies get documented. That's what you do. Friday, November 17th. We worked through the day, turned the corner onto the southern boundary line, and made good time despite the difficult terrain. The problem zone was behind us. Now the GPS was reading clean on the southern line. No drift, no interference. The theodolite and the GPS agreed. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The air was getting colder as the afternoon wore on. The humidity had thickened too, settling into a low fog that hugged the ground and crept between the tree trunks like something breathing. By the time we packed up and headed back to the camper, visibility at ground level had dropped to maybe 40 feet above chest height. The air was clear. But down where your feet were, where the leaf litter was, the fog sat in a thin white layer that made the forest floor look like it was dissolving. We ate dinner around 6:30. Sam heated up some chili from a can. I updated my field log. The camper was warm, the windows fogged as usual, the heater doing its steady tick tick tick. Normal evening, normal routine. Around 7:15, I needed to use the bathroom. We'd been doing our business in the woods all week. There was no facility at the camper, and no point in being squeamish about it when you're 2 days from the nearest town. I grabbed my jacket and unzipped the camper door and stepped out into the cold. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. It sat at waist height, a white layer that turned the ground into something you could barely see. The air smelled like wet pine and cold earth. The trees were dark shapes rising out of the fog, their trunks disappearing upward into the canopy overhead. It was quiet, not silent. There were small sounds, the settling of wood, the occasional creak of a branch, but the kind of quiet that has a texture to it, dense, heavy. I walked about 30 feet from the camper, far enough to have privacy, and was doing what I had come out to do when the voice spoke. Eli, come look at this. It came from the tree line, from the northwest, maybe 50 feet away, right at the edge of where the fog and the dark made it impossible to see anything clearly. And it was Sam's voice. Exactly Sam's voice, the way Sam says it during the day when he finds something interesting in the terrain, a ridge feature, an unusual rock formation, something that catches his eye. Casual, unhurried. The slight upward inflection at the end, that means he's already looking at whatever it is and wants you to come see. My body started moving before my brain caught up, one step toward the tree line, then another. Because that's what you do when your partner calls you over to look at something. You go look. It's automatic. It's years of working side by side and responding to each other's calls without thinking about it. Then I stopped because Sam was in the camper. I had left him in there 30 seconds ago, sitting on his cot with his boots off, reading that paperback. He hadn't put his boots back on. He hadn't grabbed his jacket. He hadn't come outside. I stood there in the fog with my heart beating hard and fast and listened. Nothing. The voice didn't come again. The tree line was just trees and fog and dark. No movement, no shape, nothing. I finished what I'd come out to do because your body needs what it needs regardless of what your brain is doing, and walked back to the camper fast. I opened the door. Sam was right where I'd left him. Boots off, paperback open on his lap. He looked up at me when I came in and saw my face. What? He said. Did you call me just now? He looked at me like I had asked him something strange. No, I've been sitting here. He set the book down. What's wrong? I told him what I'd heard. His voice, from the tree line, saying exactly what he'd say if he were out there and had found something. Sam listened, and as I talked, I watched something shift in his expression. Not fear, exactly, but a tightening, a recognition. like something he'd been expecting had finally shown up. I didn't say that, he said. Quiet, flat. I know you didn't. We sat in silence for a while after that. The heater ticked. The fog pressed against the windows. Sam picked his book back up eventually, but he didn't read it. He held it and stared at the cover and didn't turn a page for 20 minutes. I didn't sleep well that night either. Saturday, November 18th, we worked. We didn't talk about the voice. We didn't talk about the stake or the GPS drift or the footsteps. We just worked the way you work when there's something underneath the routine that you're not ready to name. The southern boundary line went in clean. The theodolite readings were solid. The GPS agreed. Everything was where it was supposed to be on this section of the parcel. But I noticed Sam checking the tree line more than he used to. Quick glances, the kind you do when something is sitting at the edge of your awareness and won't quite leave. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did I. That evening, we ate early and went to bed early. I wanted to be up before dawn to push hard on the remaining boundary and northern line, which would close the loop and finish the survey. 2 more days, maybe less, if the weather held. Then we could drive back to Lufkin, file the report, and be done with this piece of ground. I was almost asleep when the knocking started. It was close to 11. The camper was dark except for the small red glow of the heater's indicator light. Sam was breathing slow and steady on his cot asleep, or close to it. The forest outside was doing its nighttime thing. I was right at the edge of sleep, that half state where sounds reach you but don't fully wake you, when I heard it. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, on the camper door. Not pounding, not banging, knocking. The way a person knocks when they want to let you know they're there without startling you. Polite, measured. Like someone standing on your porch at home, tapping their knuckles against the wood in that universal signal that means someone is here and wants your attention. My eyes opened. I lay still. 3 more knocks. Same rhythm, same even spacing, patient. Sam stirred on his cot. I heard him shift, heard the creak of the thin mattress as he turned toward the door. In the dark, I heard his hand move, the sound of fingers finding the edge of the cot, pushing off to sit up. Sam, I said, low, fast. He stopped moving. Don't. A pause. Then, quietly, someone's at the door. I know. The knocking came again. 3 taps. Unhurried. Like whatever was out there had all the time in the world and wasn't in any particular hurry to come inside. It just wanted us to know it was there. It just wanted us to open the door. I sat up on my cot. My hand found the small reading light above the bench, and I turned it on dim, but enough to see by. Sam was sitting up on his cot, one hand braced on the mattress, looking at the camper door. His face in the weak light was very still, very controlled. The way it gets when he's thinking hard about something and doesn't want you to see what he's thinking. The knocking stopped. Silence. Just the heater and our breathing and the quiet of the forest outside. Then the voice spoke. It's okay, Eli. It's just me. Open the door. Sam's voice. His exact voice. The way he says it's okay when something minor has gone wrong on the job and he's telling me not to worry about it. The slight drawl in the okay. The casual confidence underneath it. The tone of a man who has dealt with 100 small problems and knows this one isn't worth losing sleep over. Except Sam was sitting right there, 6 inches from me. His mouth was closed. His eyes were wide and fixed on the door, and his face had gone a color I'd never seen on him before. Not white, not pale. Something past both of those things, like the blood had simply decided to be somewhere else. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just sat there and stared at the door and breathed. Outside, the voice spoke again, patient, unhurried. Eli, come on, it's me. My hand was shaking. I noticed it like it was happening to someone else, my fingers trembling around the edge of the reading light, my grip not quite steady. I set my jaw and forced it to stop. It didn't matter if my hand was shaking. What mattered was that I didn't move toward the door. The knocking started again. 3 taps, then silence. 3 taps, silence. It went on like that, knock, wait, each cycle, maybe 30 seconds apart. The voice didn't come again after the second time. It didn't need to. The knocking was enough. It was a question being asked over and over, patient and quiet and certain that eventually the answer would be yes. I looked at Sam. He was still staring at the door. His breathing had gone shallow. "Don't answer it," I said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. Once. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the door like he was afraid it might open on its own. The knocking continued. Knock, wait, knock, wait. The rhythm never changed. The patience never wavered. It didn't get louder when we didn't respond. It didn't get softer. It just kept going, steady as a heartbeat, asking the same question every 30 seconds. I watched the clock on my phone. The knocking went on for 43 minutes. I counted every cycle, every tap and every silence between them. 43 minutes of something standing on the other side of a thin metal door 3 feet from where we were sitting, knocking politely and waiting for us to let it in. And we didn't. We sat there in the dim light of the reading lamp, and we didn't move, and we didn't speak, and we didn't open the door. And after 43 minutes, the knocking stopped. Just stopped, mid-cycle, like it had been interrupted by something we couldn't hear, or like it had simply decided it was done. The silence that followed was absolute. No footsteps moving away. No sound of anything retreating into the trees. Nothing. Just the heater and the fog pressing against the windows and the two of us sitting in the dark wondering what was on the other side of that door and whether it was still there. We didn't sleep, not a minute of it. We sat on our cots with the reading light on and the heater running, and we waited for the sky to lighten. It took forever. The hours between midnight and dawn in a camper in the woods with something like that sitting in your memory feel like they belong to a different kind of time, slower, thicker, the kind of time that doesn't move the way it's supposed to. When the gray finally started coming through the windows, that first cold suggestion of morning, I was already moving, boots on, jacket on. I didn't say anything to Sam about breakfast or the day's work or any of it. I just started packing. Sam watched me for a moment, then he started packing too. We broke camp in 20 minutes, faster than we'd ever done it. We didn't speak while we worked. We just moved, efficiently and quietly, loading gear and food and equipment into the truck bed and the cab with the kind of focused silence that comes when two people understand each other without needing words. The fog was still sitting on the ground, thick and white, and the trees were dark shapes rising out of it, and I didn't look at the tree line once, not once, because I didn't want to see if anything was standing there watching us leave. I started the engine, the cab filled with the sound of the heater and the idle and the radio, which I turned off immediately because I didn't want noise. I wanted to hear. I wanted to know if anything was following us out. We drove. The forest road wound through the pines, narrow and muddy, the truck's tires crunching through leaf litter and wet gravel. The fog clung to the ground and the headlights cut through it in weak yellow cones that didn't reach far. I drove slow enough to stay on the road, but fast enough that the distance between us and that clearing was growing with every second. About 10 minutes out, maybe halfway to the county road, my phone buzzed on the dash. The GPS app I use for navigation, not the survey GPS, just the phone's built-in mapping, had been tracking our route since we started moving. I glanced at it. The blue line on the screen showed us driving in a circle. Not a big circle, a tight one, maybe 50 yards across, looping back on itself right where we'd been camped. The GPS thought we were still there, thought we were turning, doubling back, going around in a loop. I watched the little blue dot on the screen chase itself in a tight ring for about 2 minutes before it suddenly jumped, snapped forward along the road, like it had been released from something and started tracking our actual position. Again, straight line, moving away, correct. We were not driving in a circle. I could feel the road under the tires, straight and uneven, heading out the way we'd come in. The trees were moving past the windows. We were going forward. But the phone didn't know that. For 2 minutes, the phone thought we were somewhere else. Sam saw it too. He'd been watching the screen. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a long time after the GPS corrected itself. And then he looked out the passenger window at the trees going past, and his jaw was set in a way I'd seen before, the way it sets when he's made a decision and doesn't want to talk about it. We hit the county road, then the highway. The world opened up, other cars, power lines, the distant sound of traffic. The fog thinned and disappeared. The sky went from gray to pale blue. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded normal, like nothing had happened at all. I filed the survey report with the timber company the following week, and I completed the sections. I could stand behind the eastern and southern boundaries where the instruments had agreed and the readings were clean. For the western boundary, the section with the GPS drift, I flagged it in the report as unreliable. I wrote, recommend independent resurvey of western boundary segment. GPS positioning anomaly detected in section W3 through W7, consistent readings not achievable with available equipment. Theodolite readings recorded but may require verification. I did not explain why. I did not mention the stake or the voice or the knocking or any of the rest of it. Those things don't go in survey reports. They don't go anywhere, really. They just sit in your head and take up space. The timber company sent another crew out 3 weeks later to finish the western boundary. A two-man team, experienced guys, good equipment. They did the job in 4 days, filed a clean report. No anomalies noted, no GPS drift, no problems of any kind. I don't know what to do with that information. I've thought about it a lot. Maybe whatever was in that section of ground only responds to certain people. Maybe it had moved on by the time the second crew arrived. Maybe the second crew encountered the same things we did and chose not to report them the way people do when they don't want to sound crazy. I don't know. I have no way of finding out, and I'm not sure I want to. Sam quit surveying 2 weeks after we got back. He called me on a Tuesday evening and told me he was taking a job at a hardware store in town. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. But I know why he quit, and he knows I know. And neither of us has said it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean acknowledging what happened in that camper on the night of November 18th. And some things sit better when they stay in the dark. I still survey. It's what I do. It's what I'm good at. But I don't take jobs in the big thicket anymore. Not because I think the whole forest is dangerous. I don't think that. I think it was one place, one specific stretch of ground, and something about that ground didn't want to be known, didn't want to be measured and recorded and turned into lines on a map, and it made that clear to us in the only language it had. I think about the old wooden stake sometimes, the one I pulled out of the ground on day 3. I kept it. It's sitting on a shelf in my office right now, next to a row of field logs going back 14 years. Dry wood, faded orange paint, no markings, no way to know who put it there or when or why. Just a piece of ground's way of saying, someone has been here before you. Someone tried to do what you're doing, and the ground let them, or it didn't, and either way, you're not the first one to wonder. If you work the land, anywhere, and your instruments start giving you readings that don't match, and the wrongness is localized to one specific place and doesn't match any technical explanation you can think of, there is one thing I want you to consider before you keep working. The theodolite will tell you what's there. The GPS will tell you what it thinks is there. And most of the time, those two things agree, and the ground is just ground, and you do your job and go home. But sometimes they don't agree. Sometimes the instruments disagree with each other in a place where they shouldn't, and the wrongness doesn't move, doesn't spread, doesn't change. It just sits there in one spot, like a door that won't open from either side. When that happens, pack up, leave that ground alone. Some places have been measured before by people whose names aren't in any county record. and some of them are still there in the ground, waiting to see if you'll open the door too. Don't open it. That's the last one in this set. 3 stories, 3 places, 3 groups of people who found out the hard way that the wilderness doesn't always stay quiet just because you're listening. If any of these landed with you, if you've been somewhere that felt like it was watching back, that's what the comments are for. And if you want to hear more stories like these from people who went in and came back changed, subscribe. There are more out there. There always are.